When I first bought my lakeside cabin, I thought I'd finally found the one place where I could breathe without the constant noise of city politics, workplace drama, and pushy neighbors who couldn't mind their own business. The cabin sat on 5 acres of land I inherited from my grandfather, tucked away beyond a winding dirt road that the GPS barely recognized, with towering pines that guarded the property like loyal sentinels, and a long wooden dock stretching into the calm, mirror-like water where you could see every cloud reflected. I'd left the corporate world behind after a messy bout that left me with enough cash to fix up the place and live comfortably. But more importantly, I wanted peace, something my grandfather always said you couldn't buy, only protect. What I didn't know then was that my new neighbors were part of a particularly aggressive HOA that had been trying for years to absorb every property around the lake into their jurisdiction. Not out of necessity, but out of some twisted desire for control, and apparently my little slice of heaven was one of the last few holdouts. The HOA's president, a woman named Clarissa Henderson, who everyone called Karen behind her back because of her notorious temper, had been sending me letters almost from the day I moved in, each one more condescending than the last, warning me about non-compliance with HOA standards even though my home wasn't under their authority, pointing out things like the unsightly color of my dock or the overgrown nature of my wildflower patches, which were actually part of a certified pollinator garden. I ignored her because I knew my rights, but apparently that silence only fueled her obsession. The first time I saw Clarissa in person, she was marching up my driveway in high heels, completely impractical for the dirt path, clutching a manila folder like it was a sword, demanding I attend an emergency HOA meeting to discuss my integration into the community, a phrase that, in her tone, sounded more like surrender to our rule. I laughed, told her politely that my land was private, and shut the door. Her eyes burned with the kind of indignation only someone deeply convinced of their own authority could muster. After that, the harassment escalated. Trucks would accidentally park in front of my driveway during the weekends. Official-looking notices would appear taped to my gate, and one morning I found a bright orange sticker on my cabin's front window claiming it was scheduled for compliance inspection, something they had absolutely no right to do. My friends told me to leer up, but I was more curious than angry, wondering just how far Clarissa and her board would push this nonsense. That curiosity turned to genuine concern one Friday morning when I had to leave town for a week to help a friend move across state lines. I'd been tinkering with a new piece of tech. I'd gotten into drones, and I had set up a small fleet of them for aerial photography of the lake, wildlife tracking, and yes, the occasional property check when I was away. They were quiet, solar recharging, and had live streaming capabilities that fed directly into a private cloud account I could access from anywhere. 2 days into my trip, I got a motion alert from one of the drones hovering over my property's southern boundary, and when I opened the feed, my stomach dropped. A massive yellow bulldozer, flanked by 2 pickup trucks and several men in neon vests, was rolling slowly up my driveway. They weren't random trespassers, they were contractors. And behind them, standing with her hands on her hips like she was directing a Broadway play, was Clarissa. She was pointing at my cabin, gesturing wildly, and from the way the contractors were nodding, it was clear she was giving the order to demolish. I couldn't believe it. There had been no court order, no notice from any legal authority, nothing. These people were about to destroy my home purely because they thought they could get away with it while I was gone. Adrenaline surged through me, but so did a calculating calm. I toggled the drone's audio feed, and sure enough, I caught Clarissa saying, "We'll level it today, clear the debris tomorrow, and then it's ours. He won't have a leg to stand on." I hit record knowing this was gold, then switched to my other drones to get multiple angles, front view, aerial, and one perched in the trees for a perfect long shot. They started smashing through the front porch like it was nothing, the bulldozers, blades slicing through the wood with a crunching groan that made my chest ache. But at the same time, I realized the footage I was capturing wasn't just for me, it was evidence, undeniable and time-stamped, that I could take straight to law enforcement. What Clarissa didn't know was that one of my drones was linked not just to my cloud, but also to a friend of mine in the county sheriff's office who'd set up a test for real-time feed sharing for emergencies. As soon as I tapped the alert option, he was getting the same live view I was. 10 minutes later, I got a text from him, already en route. Don't say a word to them, we'll handle it. I stayed glued to the feed, heart pounding, watching, as Clarissa strutted through the wreckage in her designer blazer and sunglasses, looking for all the world like she'd just conquered a small nation, completely oblivious to the fact that her little coup was being streamed live not only to me, but now to multiple law enforcement officers. The thought hit me then, Clarissa had no idea she had just crossed the kind of line you don't come back from. And when this was over, it wasn't just going to be about rebuilding my home, it was going to be about making sure she and everyone involved answered for every splinter they broke. The moment the bulldozer's blade pierced the first wall of my cabin on the live drone feed, my stomach dropped, but I didn't let panic cloud my thinking. Instead, I switched into a cold, calculating mode, my mind firing through every legal, technical, and tactical option available to me as the situation unfolded in real time, because here's the thing, this wasn't just some backwoods shack to me. This was my home, my retreat, my investment, and the culmination of years of hard work and money poured into a property I had purchased outright and meticulously, maintained for years, and now watching a group of HOA board members stand around, sipping coffee while a paid demolition crew turned it into rubble. I knew exactly what was happening. They were making a power play. A show of dominance, the kind of reckless and arrogant move that only happens when people think the victim is far away, powerless, and unable to respond. But what they didn't know was that I had anticipated HOA shenanigans long before this day and had set up my entire property with multiple security redundancies, including 4 aerial drones with AI-assisted auto-tracking cameras, an encrypted satellite uplink, and a cloud-based evidence storage system that began live streaming the destruction to both my phone and several trusted contacts the second it detected heavy machinery crossing my boundary line. And as my jaw clenched, I called the county sheriff's office while still watching the feed, my voice steady as I explained that an unauthorized demolition was currently in progress on my private property, providing them with the live feed link and GPS coordinates within seconds. The dispatcher patched me to a lieutenant who knew me personally from the volunteer search and rescue work I'd done in the area, and he assured me a unit was en route, but I knew it would take at least 20 minutes for them to reach my remote location, and judging by the pace of the destruction, my home would be completely leveled before then, so my priority became securing irrefutable evidence and making sure every involved party from the driver of the bulldozer to the smug HOA president was caught red-handed with no wiggle room for excuses, insurance loopholes, or claims of misunderstanding. The drone's mics picked up their conversation crystal clear. The HOA president, a woman named Brenda, who had been a thorn in my side since the day I refused to sign their membership agreement, was bragging about how this eyesore was finally going to be dealt with and that the county will thank us for it later, which was hilarious considering my cabin was fully up to code, taxes were paid in full, and their HOA had zero legal jurisdiction over my land. They were quite literally trespassing and committing criminal property destruction in broad daylight, which told me they either had an absurd overconfidence in their perceived authority or they believed they had someone in local government ready to cover their tracks. And either way, that made me even more determined to go nuclear with my response. My lawyer, a sharp and relentless litigator named Mason, answered my call on the first ring and within moments was drafting emergency injunction papers while also contacting his own private investigator to start pulling property maps, HOA charter, documents, and communications records that could link Brenda and her cronies to premeditated action. Meanwhile, I texted my friend Eric, who lived about 15 minutes from my cabin, and asked him to get to the site immediately with his GoPro to film everything from ground level. Eric was a retired Marine who didn't scare easily, and by the time his truck came into view on the drone's side camera, the demolition crew paused just long enough to see him roll down his window and announce loudly, "You know you're on live video being recorded for the police, right?" The foreman's face went pale, but Brenda stepped forward with that kind of overinflated authority tone, telling him to mind his business and claiming they had board approval, which under state law was utterly meaningless outside. HOA owned property, but that didn't stop her from doubling down, waving a printed piece of paper as if it were some legal decree when in reality it was probably nothing more than a meeting agenda. The drones caught everything, the bulldozer pushing through my kitchen, the sound of splintering beams, the HOA treasurer laughing and making jokes about turning it into a picnic area, and then the sudden shift in mood when two county sheriff SUVs came tearing up the gravel road, lights flashing, sirens off, but energy unmistakably tense. The deputy stepped out, immediately ordering the crew to cut the engines on all machinery. And when Brenda tried to insert herself into the conversation, the senior deputy, someone I'd worked with during a flood relief effort 2 years ago, told her flatly to step aside or be detained for obstruction, which momentarily wiped the smirk off her face. The officers took statements on scene, photographing the damage while the drone footage continued to capture wide angles from above, and I instructed the AI system to automatically upload every second of recorded video to a secure drive labeled HOA Demolition criminal case, so there would be no risk of accidental deletion or mysterious file corruption later, because I knew from experience that when wealthy HOA board members get caught doing something illegal, their first move is to try and make the evidence disappear. The deputies detained the bulldozer operator and the foreman on suspicion of criminal mischief and trespassing, letting the HOA board members know that they were not free to leave pending further investigation, and by the time the call came from Mason saying the emergency injunction had been granted by a judge, effectively freezing any further action on my property, the look of dawning horror on Brenda's face was priceless. The best part? The live stream had already gone semi-viral because one of my tech-savvy friends had mirrored it to a local community Facebook group where hundreds of residents, many of whom already hated the HOA for their overreach, were watching and commenting. In real time, meaning the court of public opinion was already turning against them before a single formal charge had been filed. I knew the legal battle was only just beginning, but in that moment, watching them squirm under the scrutiny of both law enforcement and a growing online audience, I felt the first rush of satisfaction that comes from knowing you've caught your enemies so red-handed that even their best lawyers won't be able to spin the narrative in their favor. By the time the third day rolled around after I returned from my trip, the story of the bulldozing my house while my drones streamed it lived to the police had gone viral in a way I never expected, drawing in reporters, community activists, lawyers, and a surprisingly large group of people who'd been wronged by their HOAs and were eager to see some kind of public reckoning. And as the legal gears began grinding forward, I realized that I now had more leverage than I'd ever imagined. Not just because the drone footage was crystal clear, showing HOA President Marla directing a construction crew to take down my home without a permit or court order, but because the footage also revealed things they definitely didn't want the public to see, like their side deals with certain contractors. The fact that the bulldozer driver admitted on camera that Marla said she'd handle the paperwork later, and even snippets of conversation where board members laughed about what they were doing. The police had been more than happy to take my statement after watching the live stream, and the district attorney's office quickly opened an investigation. But what they didn't know, and what I had intentionally kept to myself, was that my security system had stored not only the live drone feed but also audio from wireless mics I'd hidden in my shed and mailbox post, which caught Marla openly discussing how they were going to teach me a lesson for thinking I could ignore HOA rules, despite the fact that my property had been legally exempt from the HOA since the neighborhood was first developed, and that damning audio was going to be the nail in the coffin for their defense. Meanwhile, Marla's public demeanor had shifted from smug to frantic as more media outlets picked up the story, with her being confronted outside HOA offices by cameras and shouted questions, her legal team scrambling to issue statements claiming it was a misunderstanding while she tried to frame me as an aggressive troublemaker, a strategy that backfired instantly once the footage was played on the evening news showing. me calmly asking them to leave the property in a prior dispute months before, followed by her shoving a letter in my face that said I had 30 days to comply with a fence paint requirement even though my fence had been torn down by their contractor. The neighbors began to split into factions, with some staunchly defending the HOA of fear of fines and retaliation, and others openly siding with me, seeing me as a chance to finally hold the board accountable for years of petty tyranny. And soon I found myself hosting informal town hall meetings in my temporary rental, where people would share horror stories of the HOA demanding fees for non-existent violations, ignoring repair requests for common areas, or issuing citations for things like holiday decorations being put up too early. My lawyer, a sharp, uncheckable woman named Elise Torres, began piecing together a civil suit that was going to be devastating, not just for property damage and emotional distress, but for violations of state HOA statutes, trespassing, destruction of private property, and even conspiracy, since the recorded conversations made it clear that multiple board members had coordinated the demolition with full awareness that it was illegal. At the same time, the DA's office moved forward with criminal charges, starting with willful destruction of property and unauthorized use of heavy equipment, and possibly moving toward fraud once they realized the HOA had been using member dues to fund side projects and maintenance that never actually occurred, a discovery that came courtesy of one brave HOA treasurer who decided to anonymously hand over copies of financial records that, to Elise's delight, showed large unexplained withdrawals and payments to shell companies connected to Marla's brother. The deeper we dug, the more it became obvious that this wasn't just a case of my house being bulldozed, but a pattern of abuse, intimidation, and self-dealing that had gone on for years under everyone's noses, and I began to feel a growing sense of responsibility to see it through, not only for myself, but for every homeowner they'd wronged. Still, the process was exhausting: depositions, media interviews, and tense encounters in public where Marla or her supporters would glare at me or mutter insults as they passed, but the exhaustion was tempered by the slow, steady satisfaction of watching the walls close in on them, especially when the court granted a temporary freeze on HOA assets pending the outcome of the investigation, effectively shutting down their ability to issue fines or pay themselves stipends. At one particularly memorable pretrial hearing, Marla tried to address the judge directly, claiming I was weaponizing the media against her. But the judge, clearly unimpressed, reminded her that the media wouldn't be interested if she hadn't bulldozed a house without permission, and suggested she focus on her legal defense instead of public perception. I left that courtroom with a rare smile, knowing that no matter how long it took, the HOA was about to face consequences on a scale they'd never imagined, and that my next move, which Elise and I were saving for just the right moment, would ensure they could never quietly settle and walk away without every sordid detail coming to light. The court date finally arrived, and as I stepped out of my truck in front of the county courthouse, I could feel every eye turn toward me, but not in sympathy and curiosity, because the whole town had been buzzing about the case where a homeowners association allegedly bulldozed a man's home while he was away and got caught, red-handed, by a drone camera streaming it live to police. The footage having already been replayed on local news so many times that even the courthouse janitor could quote my own angry words from that day. But while the HOA board had been smug and defiant in the weeks leading up to the trial, treating it like a minor property dispute they could bluff their way out of, I knew the moment they saw the evidence in full they were going to regret every smug smirk, every condescending letter, and every bit of arrogance they had shown when they thought I was powerless. Inside the courtroom, my attorney was already set up with a massive projection screen and a laptop connected to a portable drive containing hours of high-definition drone footage, multiple angles, timestamp overlays, and even a live audio recording. That captured the moment their hired demolition crew started laughing about how I was going to freak out when I saw my cabin gone. And when the judge entered, the room went dead silent as we all rose before taking our seats again. The HOA's legal team, a trio of expensive-looking attorneys in matching gray suits, acting as if they were in control, filing their nails. Metaphorically, while they tried to get the case dismissed on some flimsy procedural technicality, but the judge, a no-nonsense woman with 20 years on the bench and a reputation for not tolerating games, immediately shut that down and told them this was going to trial right here and now. The first witness called was the police officer who had been on duty the day my drone's live stream popped up in their monitoring feed, and he testified in painstaking detail how he had watched in real time as a perfectly intact home mine was illegally demolished without any permits, court orders, or legal justification, describing how he immediately contacted dispatch to send a unit while also screen recording the footage for evidence. And when the HOS lawyer tried to cross-examine him by suggesting maybe I had given prior consent, the officer smirked and simply pointed out that the audio in the video clearly recorded me shouting from hundreds of miles away via the drone's mic, "That's my house! Stop! You're destroying my property." And yes, the courtroom laughed at that, even the judge trying to hide a smile. Then it was my turn, and I took the stand with the calm, deliberate confidence of someone holding every single ace in the deck, telling the story from the beginning, how the HOA had been pressuring me for months to sell my land so they could expand the community amenities, how I had repeatedly refused, and how I had left for a work trip thinking the worst they might do was send me another nasty letter, not send in a bulldozer. And as my lawyer queued up the drone footage for the court, the lights dimmed and the screen lit up with crystal clear images of the day. Everything went down, the HOA president in a wide-brimmed sun hat gesturing dramatically to the demolition crew, clipboard in hand, the engine roar of heavy machinery tearing into the walls, and the sickening sight of my roof collapsing in on itself as dust billowed into the blue summer sky. The audio was even more damning snippets of conversation like, "He'll have to sell now," and "This will teach him to ignore us," echoing through the courtroom like confessions. And when the footage cut to the moment the police arrived, hands on their belts and faces hard, the HOA president's face went pale on screen in front of everyone. The defense tried to argue that the video might have been altered, but then the prosecution rolled out the chain of custody, documentation showing the files had gone straight from the drone's cloud storage to police servers without a single gap, verified by timestamps, GPS data, and metadata showing my property coordinates, which the judge reviewed closely before nodding and telling the HOA's lawyers that unless they had a miraculous alternative explanation, she was prepared to let the jury watch every single minute of the footage from multiple angles. The jury, for their part, seemed riveted, and I could tell from their expressions, raised eyebrows, tight lips, and head shakes that the HOA's fate was sealed. But my attorney wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, because next came the financial expert we'd hired to calculate the exact replacement cost of my home, down to the penny, including architectural plans, labor, materials, permits, and even the irreplaceable personal items destroyed inside, bringing the total damages to well over $1.2 million. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he added the projected loss of rental income I would have earned from short-term leasing the property during peak tourist seasons, pushing the number past $1.5 million before punitive damages were even considered. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the OAS lawyers were sweating visibly, their clients whispering angrily at them from behind the table, and my lawyer delivered a devastating summation about property rights, abuse of power, and the arrogance of organizations that think they're above the law, ending with the line, "If they can do this to him, they can do it to any of you," and I swear I saw at least 2 jurors nod in agreement. The deliberation took less than an hour, and when they filed back in, the forepersons stood and read the verdict loud and clear. "We find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts," awarding me full compensatory damages, punitive damages of $2 million and full legal fees to be paid by the HOA within 90 days, plus a court order stripping them of their ability to enforce any rule or regulation on my property ever again. The OA president looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. The rest of the board slumped in defeat, and I just sat there, feeling the weight of vindication settle over me like a warm blanket. But the best part came 3 weeks later. when the county sheriff himself, who happened to be a good friend, called to tell me the HOA hadn't paid up and was facing asset seizure, which meant their community center, their office building, and even the fancy ornamental entrance sign were going up for auction to cover what they owed me. And I made sure to be there on auction day, standing front row with a coffee in hand as the gavel came down on each piece of their empire, knowing that my once lonely patch of land now stood as a monument to the fact that sometimes the little guy doesn't just win, he wins so hard the other side never recovers. And as I drove back past the empty lot where my house had once stood, I didn't feel bitterness anymore, only satisfaction, because soon a brand new home would rise there, stronger than ever, paid for entirely with HOA money. And my drone would still be hovering high above, watching, just in case anyone ever got any